The air in the First National Bank of Atlanta was thick with the usual blend of polished marble and quiet tension. That's when Michael Carter walked in, a tall, distinguished black man in his late 50s dressed in a tailored navy suit, his posture radiating the kind of quiet confidence that comes from decades of success. He carried nothing but his driver's license and a corporate debit card from Carter Enterprises. The transaction had been scheduled days in advance, a $500,000 cash withdrawal for a high-stakes real estate deal. But what should have been routine turned into a masterclass in prejudice. Jessica, the teller, barely glanced up from her screen when Michael approached. But the moment she saw the amount, her fingers froze. Her lips pursed into a tight line, and that familiar look flickered across her face, the one that screamed, "This doesn't add up." Without a word, she hit a button under the desk, summoning the branch manager, Richard Whitmore. Richard strutted over, his slicked back hair and custom loafers oozing a superiority he'd clearly been born into. He didn't ask for ID, didn't verify the account, just crossed his arms and said, "We've had issues with fraud lately. You'll need to come back with your banker." Michael's jaw tightened. "The appointment was confirmed Monday. Your team ran the checks." Richard smirked, glancing at Jessica, who stifled a laugh. "Sure. But we can't just hand over $500,000 to anyone who walks in with a nice suit." The condescension dripped like syrup. Michael leaned in, his voice low but razor-sharp. "You have my ID, my face, my company's card. What you don't have is an excuse." Just then, a woman in line, a regular who'd watched the whole scene, stepped forward. "I know who he is," she said, pulling out her phone. "Carter Enterprises. That's the firm that just bought the old Howell building. You're on the news, sir." The lobby fell silent. Richard's face drained of color. Suddenly, the bank's head of security appeared, whispering something in Richard's ear. Turns out the regional manager had been watching the whole thing on the security feed. 2 minutes later, Michael walked out with his money and a written apology from the bank. But the real win. The video that went viral by dinner with the caption, "Guess who doesn't look like $500,000 now?" Michael didn't move an inch. Instead, he reached into his briefcase and slid a single sheet of paper across the counter, a printed email from the bank's regional director confirming the withdrawal. Richard's smirk faltered for just a second before he pushed it back. "Anyone can forge an email," he scoffed. Behind him, Jessica let out a derisive snort, rolling her eyes like this was some tired con. Then the whispers started. A man in line, Marcus, a construction foreman with calloused hands and no patience for injustice, leaned toward his wife. "Ain't no way they'd treat a white man like this," he muttered, just loud enough to carry. Nearby, an elderly woman, Mrs. Wilkins, clutched her purse tighter, her lips pressed into a thin line. She'd banked here for 30 years. She knew exactly what was happening. Angela, the new teller, couldn't take it anymore. Her fingers trembled as she pulled up the account again, VIP status, 7-figure balance, all the flags that should have made this transaction effortless. She opened her mouth, but Richard shot her a glare that snapped it shut. That's when Michael's phone buzzed. He didn't answer, just smiled, cold, knowing. Outside, tires screeched. The glass doors swung open, and in walked a woman in a sharp pantsuit, flanked by 2 men in suits. "Mary Whitaker, Regional Compliance Officer," she announced, her voice slicing through the tension. Richard's face went slack. Jessica's pen clattered to the floor. Mary didn't even look at them. She walked straight to Michael. "Mr. Carter, my apologies for the delay." Then she turned to Richard. "You just refused service to one of our top clients. On camera. With witnesses." Her smile was venomous. "Let's discuss your resignation." The lobby erupted. Marcus let out a low whistle. Mrs. Wilkins nodded, satisfied, and Angela. She finally spoke up. "I tried to tell them," she blurted, her voice shaking. "I pulled up everything. They just didn't want to believe it." Richard's mouth opened, but no words came out. The security guard who'd been ready to escort Michael out moments ago now stepped back, hands raised, like he wanted no part of what came next. Michael pocketed his phone. "Funny," he said, quiet enough that only Richard heard. You thought you were the one in control. Then he turned to Mary. Let's get my money and cancel all of Carter Enterprises' accounts with this branch. As he walked out, the other customers erupted into applause. Richard stood frozen, his career crumbling in real time. And Jessica. She was already deleting her social media because someone had just live-streamed the whole thing. James's grip tightened on David's shoulder, but the moment his fingers dug in, the bank's front doors burst open. A gust of wind swept through the lobby as 3 figures strode in. Mary, flanked by 2 attorneys in sharp suits, one carrying a thick legal binder. The air crackled with tension. Mary didn't even glance at Thomas or Jessica. She walked straight to David, her heels clicking like a countdown. "Mr. Coleman," she said, handing him a document. "We've got everything." Thomas's smirk vanished. He snatched the paper from David's hand, his eyes darting across the page, then froze. It was a notarized letter from the bank's CEO authorizing the withdrawal and explicitly naming David as a top-tier client. The blood drained from his face. Jessica, still oblivious, leaned over the counter. "Oh, come on," she sneered. "You really think some fake letter's gonna—" "Shut up, Jessica." Thomas hissed, his voice strangled. The room went dead silent. That's when Angela stood up. Her chair screeched against the floor as she turned her monitor toward the crowd, revealing David's account details in bold letters. Coleman Holdings, issue CEO, 12.8 million, assets under management. "It's real," she said, her voice shaking, but clear. "And you all knew it." A gasp rippled through the lobby. Sharon pulled out her phone and started recording. Robert crossed his arms, glaring at James. "You still want to escort him out, big man?" James dropped his hand from David's shoulder like it was on fire. Mary stepped forward, her voice icy. "Thomas, you're suspended pending investigation. Jessica HR wants a word." She turned to David. "Your money's being prepared now, and the bank will be covering the legal fees for today's misunderstanding." David finally moved just enough to adjust his cufflinks. "No," he said calmly. "I don't want the money anymore." He nodded to one of the attorneys who produced another document. "What I want is this branch audited. Every transaction, every denial of service, every discretionary account freeze for the past 5 years." He looked at Angela. "You'll help them, won't you?" Angela nodded, tears in her eyes. As David turned to leave, Thomas lunged forward. "You can't do this," he spat. Mary blocked him. "Oh, he absolutely can." She smiled. "Funny thing about private institutions, they still have to follow federal anti-discrimination laws." The last thing the lobby heard was David's quiet remark to Sharon as he passed her, "They always forget the cameras." Outside news vans were already pulling up. The moment Thomas lifted the receiver, the lobby doors swung open again, this time revealing Charles himself, flanked by 2 bank executives and a security detail. His face was stormy, his tie slightly askew like he'd sprinted from his office. The crowd parted silently as he marched straight to Thomas, not even glancing at David or Mary. "You idiot," Charles hissed low enough that only the front desk could hear. "Do you have any idea who you've been harassing?" Thomas opened his mouth, but Charles cut him off with a sharp gesture toward the documents in Mary's hands. "Those aren't just real. They're the kind of papers that get entire branches shut down." He turned to David, his demeanor shifting instantly to contrition. "Mr. Coleman, I can't apologize enough for this. Unfortunate misunderstanding." David didn't smile. "Misunderstanding." He repeated the word like it left a bad taste. "Your manager accused me of fraud in front of a lobby full of people. Your teller laughed at me. Your guard tried to physically remove me." He paused, letting the weight of it sink in. "That's not a misunderstanding, Charles. That's a pattern." A murmur of agreement rose from the customers. Sharon, still recording, zoomed in on Charles's sweating forehead. Robert crossed his arms and muttered, "Damn right." Charles's jaw tightened. He turned to Thomas. "Clean out your desk. Jessica HR now. James, you're suspended pending review." Then to the stunned lobby, First National deeply regrets today's incident. All customers present will receive a $500 courtesy credit for their time. Mary scoffed. Generous, but insufficient. She tapped the leather folder. Coleman Holdings is liquidating its stake in your bank, and this— She pulled out a final document, a lawsuit draft with the words racial discrimination bolded across the top, is going public tonight. Charles looked like he might vomit. David finally moved, stepping toward Angela, who was still frozen at her terminal. He handed her a business card. "If you're ever looking for a job where integrity matters," he said quietly, "call me." As he walked out, the lobby erupted, some in applause, others in furious whispers. Outside, news cameras swarmed their lights, flooding the sidewalk. The last thing Thomas heard before the door closed was Charles snarling, "You've ruined us." And in the parking lot, David slid into his car, finally letting his mask drop just long enough to exhale. "Mary," he said, "call the Times." The air in the bank grew heavier with each passing second. David remained motionless, his silence more powerful than any outburst could have been. Mary methodically spread the documents across the counter like a prosecutor presenting evidence, each page a damning indictment of the bank's prejudice. Charles finally picked up the phone, his voice tinny through the receiver. "Thomas, what's the—" "It's over." Thomas interrupted, his voice hollow. He didn't even wait for a response before hanging up. A beat passed. Then the back office door burst open. Charles stormed out, his face flushed, followed by two senior executives. He took one look at the documents, then at David, and his shoulders slumped. "Mr. Coleman." He began, but David held up a hand. "Save it," David said. He turned to the gathered customers, Sharon gripping her phone, Robert shaking his head, others murmuring in disbelief. "This wasn't about me," he said, his voice carrying. "It was about every person who's ever walked in here and been treated like they don't belong. Every customer who's been randomly selected for extra scrutiny. Every employee forced to stay silent." His gaze lingered on Angela, who wiped her eyes. Mary slid one final document forward, a press release time-stamped for 500 p.m., announcing Coleman Holdings' immediate divestment from First National. Charles's breath hitched. "You can't—" "I already did," David said. He turned to leave, then paused at the door. "Oh, and Charles," he didn't raise his voice, "clean house, or the next investor who walks out will take the whole bank down with them." As the glass doors swung shut behind him, the lobby erupted, not in chaos but in something more dangerous. Quiet, furious resolve. Phones were out recording posting. Sharon hit send on a video titled, "Racism at First National CEO Exposed." Robert pulled out his wallet and removed his debit card, dropping it into the nearest trash can. Behind the counter, Jessica stared at her screen where an email from HR had just appeared. Termination effective immediately. And Angela. She stood up, took off her teller badge, and placed it neatly on the counter. Then she walked out straight to David's waiting car where he held the door open. "You've got guts," he said. "Let's put them to better use." The news vans arrived before the bank even closed. By midnight, banking while black was trending. And by morning, First National stock had plummeted, all because one man refused to be treated like a criminal in his own bank. Charles straightened, the weight of David's words settling over the room like a verdict. The bank's polished marble floors and gleaming counters suddenly felt like a stage one where every player's role had just been exposed. "You're right," Charles said, his voice low. "And it won't happen again." He turned to Thomas, his expression hardening. "You're fired, effective immediately. Security will escort you out." Thomas opened his mouth to protest, to beg, maybe, but Charles cut him off with a look. Then he addressed Jessica without glancing her way. "You too. HR has your termination paperwork waiting." A stunned hush fell. James, the security guard, stepped forward, not to remove David this time, but to flank Thomas and Jessica as they were led away. Jessica's heels clicked unevenly as she walked, her earlier smirk replaced by trembling lips. Thomas looked like a man who'd just realized his entire career had evaporated in 5 minutes. David watched them go, then turned to Charles. Firing 2 people doesn't fix systemic bias. Charles met his gaze. It's a start. The rest? He gestured to Angela, who stood tall now, her teller badge still pinned to her blouse. She'll be interim branch manager while we audit every transaction from the past year. Any denials, any suspicious activity, flags, we're reviewing them all. A murmur of approval rippled through the lobby. Sharon lowered her phone, her recording now complete. Robert nodded once, sharp and satisfied. Mary tapped her watch. Press conference is in an hour, she reminded David quietly. The Times is already asking for comment. David took one last look around the bank at the cameras still rolling, at Angela squaring her shoulders behind the counter, at Charles's stiff posture of a man who knew his institution had failed. Then he adjusted his cufflinks and headed for the door. As he stepped into the sunlight, reporters surged forward. Microphones jabbed toward him. "Mr. Coleman, what's your message to other black professionals facing discrimination?" one shouted. David paused. "Simple," he said. "Document everything. Speak up, and when they least expect it." He glanced back at the bank's logo above the doors. "Own the damn building." Behind him, through the glass, Angela picked up the phone, her first call as manager, and dialed HR. "I need the files for every customer complaint since last January," she said. "We've got work to do." By the next morning, Banking While Black wasn't just a hashtag, it was a federal investigation. And David Coleman. He wasn't just a CEO, he'd become a warning. David didn't raise his voice, but his words cut deeper than any shout could. "Doing your job." He took a single step forward. "Your job is to protect customers. All customers, not just the ones who look like you." James's shoulders slumped, his earlier defiance crumbling. Then David turned to Angela. The room held its breath. But instead of condemnation, he simply said, "You spoke up when it mattered. That takes courage." Angela swallowed hard, blinking back tears. Charles cleared his throat. "Effective immediately," he announced. "Thomas, Jessica, and James are terminated. Not just from this branch, from the entire First National system." He looked at David. "And we're implementing mandatory anti-bias training for all employees starting tomorrow." David nodded, but his gaze never left Thomas. "You think this is about losing your job?" He reached into his suit pocket and pulled out a folded newspaper, tomorrow's edition, fresh from the press. The headline blared, "Bank Manager Refuses Black CEO Service Shareholders Demand Overhaul." Thomas's hands shook as he took the paper. His eyes darted to the byline, the Washington Post, then to the stock ticker at the bottom of the page. First National shares had already dropped 18%. "That's the real cost of prejudice," David said quietly. "Not just careers, legacies." Outside, the last of the news vans were packing up. Sharon tucked her phone away, satisfied. Robert clapped once, sharp and final. And Mary held the door open as David walked out into the evening air, not as a victim, not as a victor, but as a man who'd forced an entire system to see itself clearly. As his car pulled away, the bank's digital sign flickered. Then, in bold letters, it displayed a new message: First National Bank under new leadership. Inside, Angela was already at Thomas's old desk drafting an email to every customer who'd been denied service in the past 6 months. The subject line, "We owe you an apology." Somewhere across town, David's phone buzzed with a text from the mayor, "We need to talk about banking reform. Dinner tomorrow." He smiled. The work was just beginning. David's words hung in the air like a verdict etched in stone. The bank's fluorescent lights seemed to dim under the weight of the moment. Angela wiped her cheeks with the back of her hand, her quiet sobs the only sound in the stillness. Charles cleared his throat. "Effective immediately," he announced. "This branch will undergo a full audit not just of transactions but of every customer interaction flagged as suspicious in the past 2 years. He glanced at David, then added, "And we're instituting a new policy. Any employee who witnesses discrimination and fails to report it will be held equally accountable." Daniel, the intern, suddenly stepped forward, his voice cracking with nervous energy. "I'll help," he blurted out. "With the audit, I mean. I keep records of everything." He held up his notepad filled with meticulous notes from the day's events. David studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Good. Start with today's security footage. Preserve every second." Outside, the last streaks of sunset painted the Atlanta skyline in oranges and purples. Through the bank's windows, the crowd could see Thomas standing on the curb, frantically dialing his phone, only to have each call go unanswered. Jessica sat on a bench, her head in her hands, while James stared blankly at his discarded badge in his palm. Mary handed David his coat. "The board's emergency meeting starts in 20 minutes, she murmured. "They're voting on Charles's proposal to tie executive bonuses to diversity metrics." David shrugged into his coat, then paused to look back at the remaining staff. "Change doesn't happen because one man wins a fight," he said. "It happens because everyone who watched decides they're done tolerating the same old story." He tapped the newspaper still on the counter, the one with tomorrow's headline. This is just the first page." As he walked out, Sharon pressed a folded note into his hand. It read, "My grandson, Banks, here. Thank you for making it safe for him." Down the street, a news crew was setting up for a live segment. The chyron at the bottom of the screen read, "First National Stock plummets after racism scandal." And in the quiet of his car, David finally let out the breath he'd been holding all afternoon. His phone buzzed an alert from his investment team. Coleman Holdings had just purchased a controlling stake in another major bank. This time, he'd make sure the doors opened for everyone. "But I wrote everything down. Every word, every look, every time someone should have spoken up, but didn't." His hands trembled as he held out the notebook, its pages filled with meticulous shorthand. "I thought maybe this could help make sure it doesn't happen again." David took the notebook, flipping through pages that documented the entire ordeal, Thomas's sneer, Jessica's muttered slurs, the exact times Angela had glanced at her screen in silent conflict. He closed it slowly and looked at Daniel. "This," he said, tapping the notebook, "is how real change starts. Not with grand speeches, but with someone willing to record the truth when everyone else pretends not to see it." Charles exhaled sharply as if struck by realization. "We could have used this kind of accountability years ago." He turned to the remaining staff. "Starting tomorrow, every trainee in this bank will shadow Daniel for a week. If you can't recognize discrimination when it's happening, you have no business handling people's livelihoods." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Mary, silent until now, stepped forward with a folder. "For those wondering what's next," she said, passing copies to Charles and Angela. "This is Coleman Holdings' new partnership proposal. We're funding an independent review of every customer complaint from the past 5 years, and we're paying bonuses to employees who report bias before it escalates." Angela's eyes widened as she scanned the document. You're giving us resources to fix this." David shook his head. "No, I'm giving you permission to fix it. The resources were always here." He gestured around the lobby to the cameras, the complaint forms, the employees who'd stayed. "You just have to choose to use them." Outside, the streetlights flickered on as dusk settled over the city. Through the glass doors, they could see Thomas arguing with a reporter, his voice muffled but his desperation clear. Jessica was already deleting her social media accounts. James sat on the curb staring at his phone, likely realizing no other bank would hire a guard who'd manhandled a CEO. David buttoned his suit jacket. "The board votes tonight on Charles's promotion to regional director, and Angela." He handed her a business card. "My team needs someone who understands how broken systems work and how to rebuild them. Call me tomorrow if you're interested." As he walked out, Daniel hurried after him. "Mr. Coleman, wait." He held out a pen. You forgot to sign my notebook." David smiled for the first time all day. He scribbled 3 words above Daniel's meticulous notes. "Stay this brave." The next morning, the bank opened under new management. The first customer through the door, a young black college student there to deposit his scholarship check. Angela greeted him by name. Daniel watched from his new desk, no longer an intern but the official compliance liaison. And on the wall behind them, a new plaque read, "In this branch, every customer gets treated like a CEO." Somewhere in a high-rise downtown, David sipped his coffee and tapped "Send" on an email to 200 corporate executives. The subject line, "Your turn." The work, after all, was never just his. It belonged to anyone willing to do it. David turned back to the group, his voice steady but charged with something deeper than resolve, a quiet fire. Let the press ask. Let the board debate. Let the whole country see what happens when dignity gets treated like an option. He glanced at the security cameras in the ceiling corners. Because every frame of footage from today, it's not just evidence. It's a lesson. Charles cleared his throat. The audit team arrives tomorrow. We're reviewing every denied transaction, every suspicious activity flag from the past 3 years. He looked at Angela. You'll lead the internal training, starting with how to recognize unconscious bias before it becomes a policy. Angela, still clutching David's business card, squared her shoulders. We'll use today as the case study. No sugarcoating. Outside, the first news vans were already idling at the curb. A reporter tapped on the glass door, holding up a mic with the call letters of a major network. Mary arched an eyebrow. They're early. David adjusted his tie. Good means words spreading. He turned to Daniel, who was still gripping his notebook like a lifeline. You're with me for the press conference. First lesson accountability doesn't hide behind closed doors. Sharon reached into her purse and pulled out a worn leather journal. Take this too, she said, handing it to Daniel. 42 years of notes on how kids learn fairness. Might help your training sessions. Robert chuckled dryly. And if y'all need a mechanic's perspective on how to spot a rigged system, I've got stories that'll curl your hair. As David pushed open the bank doors, camera flashes erupted. The shouted questions blended into a roar. Mr. Coleman, will you sue? What's your message to other CEOs? But he walked straight to the mic stand they'd set up on the sidewalk. No prepared statement. No PR spin. Just the truth, raw and unfiltered. First National Bank failed today, he said, but it doesn't have to fail tomorrow. Every business in America has a choice: uphold bias or dismantle it. And if you think this isn't your problem. He gestured behind him where Angela and Daniel stood framed in the bank's doorway. Meet the people who'll prove you wrong. By midnight, banking while black was trending globally. By morning, 6 other banks had announced anti-bias training mandates. And in a quiet corner office, David scrawled a note on a legal pad. Next phase, buy the branches that refuse to change. The revolution wouldn't be televised, it would be bankrolled. Sharon's voice, weathered by years but sharp with conviction, cut through the quiet. I'm 72 years old, she said, and in my lifetime I've seen banks burn from riots and boardrooms shrug off scandals. But what happened today? She gestured to the empty space where David had stood. That man didn't come for revenge. He came for repair, and y'all got handed something rare, a chance to do better while the world's watching. Robert stepped up beside her, his work-roughened hands flexing at his sides. I fix engines for a living, he said. When something's broken, you don't just slap duct tape on it and call it a day. You take it apart, clean out the rust, and rebuild it right. He locked eyes with Charles. This place, it's been running on bias instead of integrity. Time for a full tune-up. Mary opened her briefcase and pulled out a stack of folders. Coleman Holdings Diversity Audit Framework, she said, passing them around. It's what we use to measure real change, not just policies, but outcomes. Who gets loans approved? Which branches flag suspicious transactions disproportionately? Where do complaints go to die? She tapped the top page. This isn't a punishment. It's an owner's manual. Angela flipped through her copy, then suddenly laughed, a bright, startled sound. Page 17, she said, holding it up. You track how often employees interrupt customers based on demographics. Mary's smile was razor-thin. Down to the millisecond. Charles exhaled sharply, as if finally seeing the full scope of the task ahead. 6 months, he murmured, echoing David's deadline. Then louder, Starting tomorrow, every manager in this district trains on this system. And Angela. He handed her his copy. You're leading the first session. As the staff dispersed, some to call spouses, others to stare blankly at their screens, Daniel lingered by the door. His notebook was now crammed with margin notes, track interruptions. Ask Sharon about her journal. Learn audit protocols. Mary caught his eye and tossed him a USB drive. Full data set from our last review, she said. Consider it homework. Outside, the streetlights flickered on, painting the sidewalk in pools of gold. The news vans had left, but the bank's glass doors still reflected the aftermath. Charles on the phone with corporate Angela coaching a teller through the new complaint form, Sharon and Robert sharing coffee with the night cleaning crew. And 3 blocks away, David sat in a quiet diner spinning his wedding ring absently on the Formica counter. His phone buzzed a text from Mary. They're all in, even the intern. He allowed himself one small, tired smile. Then he pulled out a napkin and began sketching a flowchart for his next move. Phase 2, the branches that refused to change. The coffee in his cup had gone cold. The work, however, was just heating up. Mary's words lingered in the air like the last note of a hymn, quiet but resonant. The bank's lobby, usually sterile under fluorescent lights, felt oddly alive now, charged with something more than obligation purpose. Angela tucked the account profile back into her drawer, her fingers lingering on the edge. 6 months, she murmured more to herself than anyone. Then louder, I'll draft a training module on unconscious bias in transaction approvals. We'll pilot it next week. Daniel practically vibrated with nervous energy. And I'll compile every customer complaint from the past year, sort them by demographic data, look for patterns. He flipped open his notebook to a fresh page, scribbling, run regression analysis on denial rates, with the fervor of a detective cracking a case. Charles watched them, his arms crossed, but his expression had softened. Good. But remember, this isn't just about fixing numbers. It's about fixing how we see people. He nodded toward the security cameras. Starting tomorrow, those aren't just for catching thieves. They're for holding us accountable. Robert chuckled, rubbing his grease-stained hands together. Hell, I'll volunteer to be your test customer. Walk in, looking like this. He gestured to his faded work shirt. See if I still get the side-eye when I ask for a loan. Sharon patted his arm. I'll join you. We'll make it a field trip. Her smile was warm, but her eyes were sharp, the look of a woman who'd graded one too many half-hearted essays in her time. And if the new First National still fails, well. She pulled out her phone. I've got David Coleman on speed dial now. The group laughed, but beneath it ran a current of steel. They all knew this wasn't performative. This was a promise. As the last staff members gathered their things, Mary slipped a card into Daniel's pocket. Coleman Holdings Internship Program, it read. Application waived. Start Monday. Outside, the Atlanta night hummed with its usual rhythm, cars honking distant sirens, the occasional burst of laughter from a nearby bar. But inside the bank, as Charles turned the key in the lock, the sound that lingered wasn't the click of the deadbolt. It was the snap of Daniel's notebook closing, a definitive, hopeful sound, like the first page of a better chapter. 6 months later, David Coleman walked back into First National not in a suit, but in jeans and a hoodie. His baseball cap pulled low. The young teller at window 3 didn't blink. "Good afternoon, Mr. Coleman," she said, smiling. Your usual withdrawal slip. Behind her, a new plaque gleamed on the wall. In this branch, dignity is non-negotiable. David didn't check the security feed, didn't audit the books, just nodded and said, "Actually, today I'm here to deposit something." He slid a check across the counter, a 7-figure investment in the bank's new community lending program. Because real change he'd learned wasn't about tearing systems down. It was about rebuilding them with the people who'd once been locked out. The morning David Coleman walked back into First National Bank, the air didn't tense. No whispers trailed him. The security guard, newly hired a black woman with a sharp eye and a sharper smile, nodded respectfully. "Mr. Coleman," she said. "Welcome back." Angela looked up from her terminal, her face breaking into a grin. 6 months to the day, she said, sliding a folder across the counter. Our equity audit. You'll find the denial rates for black customers dropped 62% after we retrained staff on unconscious bias. David flipped through the report, his eyebrows lifting at the annotated charts, the handwritten notes in the margins. Teller 3 improved after shadowing Daniel. Loan approvals up 38% in majority black zip codes. He closed the folder. This is more than I expected. Charles emerged from his office, his hand already extended. We kept our word. David shook it, then gestured to the lobby. The walls, once sterile, now featured framed photos of staff volunteering at financial literacy workshops in underserved neighborhoods. A plaque by the door displayed the bank's new mission statement, Service Without Bias. Even the music piping through the speakers had changed soft jazz instead of corporate muzak. You rebuilt it, David said almost to himself. Daniel, now sporting a lanyard that read, Equity and Inclusion Lead, stepped forward. Not just rebuilt, redesigned. He handed David a flash drive. Every policy change, every training module, every complaint resolved. It's all there, transparent, for you and the public. David pocketed the drive, then reached into his jacket. Then this belongs here. He placed a check on the counter, a 7-figure investment in the bank's new community loan program. Angela's eyes welled up. Charles exhaled sharply. Daniel just grinned. Knew you'd come through. As David turned to leave, the young teller at window 3, the same one who'd once frozen at the sight of his account balance, called out, Mr. Coleman, your receipt. He took it, glancing at the bottom. Printed beside the transaction details was a line he'd never seen on a bank slip before. Thank you for trusting us with your dignity. Outside, the Atlanta sun blazed overhead. David slid into his car, where Mary waited with a smirk. Well, he tossed the receipt onto the dashboard. They're ready. Mary tapped her phone, pulling up a list. Good, because we've got 17 more branches to visit. The engine roared to life. Somewhere ahead, another bank manager was about to learn the same lesson. Justice wasn't a favor. It was the bare minimum. And David Coleman, he was just the man to collect. David stepped out into the Atlanta sunlight, the glass doors of First National swinging shut behind him with a quiet finality. The air smelled of freshly brewed coffee from the shop next door and the faint exhaust of midday traffic, ordinary, unremarkable. But the weight of what had just transpired inside those walls was anything but. Mary leaned against the car, scrolling through her phone. Well, she asked without looking up. David slid into the passenger seat, his expression unreadable. They did the work. Mary smirked, tapping her screen. Good, because Branch 22 in Memphis just had another incident. She turned the phone toward him, a tweet from a local activist. 3rd time this month my uncle got flagged for verification at First National. When does this stop? David took a long breath, then reached for his tablet. A few swipes and the schematics for a new initiative appeared. Project Lighthouse Real-Time Bias Monitoring. He handed it to Mary. Send this to Angela and Daniel. They're ready to scale. As the car pulled away from the curb, the bank's reflection shimmered in the rear window, its glass facade catching the light, its new mission statement just visible above the door. Service Without Bias. Inside, Angela was already at her computer drafting an email to the Memphis branch manager. Daniel stood at the whiteboard mapping out a training circuit for the Southeast region. Charles sat in his office dialing the CEO of a rival bank to share their equity framework. And in the break room, Sharon and Robert lingered over coffee, retelling the story not of a confrontation, but of a reckoning that became a rebirth. Funny, ain't it? Robert mused, stirring his creamer. That man walked in for cash and walked out with something money can't buy. Sharon smiled into her tea. What's that? A legacy, Robert said, the kind that don't gather dust on plaques. Outside, the city buzzed on oblivious. But in 100 small ways, a teller double-checking her assumptions, a guard stepping in to de-escalate a young intern speaking up for the first time, the ripple continued. And somewhere down the road, another bank's doors awaited their glass panes gleaming with the reflection of a man who knew justice wasn't a destination. It was a journey. And David Coleman, he was just getting started. Fade to black. Text on screen. Based on true events. Share if you believe dignity shouldn't require a CEO's title. #banking while black. Closing narration spoken over montage of key moments. This wasn't just about one man, or one bank, or one moment. It was about the quiet power of refusing to accept how things are. Because real change doesn't always roar, sometimes it walks in, calmly speaks truth, and lets the world adjust around it. If this story stirred something in you, don't let it end here. Share it. Talk about it. Ask yourself, where can I plant seeds of change in my own world? Hit like if you believe dignity shouldn't come with conditions. Subscribe for more stories that challenge the status quo. And remember, the next time you witness injustice, you've got a choice. Let the moment pass, or be the one who changes it. Until next time, stay sharp, stay human, and never confuse silence with peace.